Mama and Maggie's Boys, Part 1, In the Blink of an Eye. Maggie went into labor on November 28, 1950. 24 long hours later, Leland's promised baby brother arrived at 5:30 a.m., just before sunrise. It had been a long, hard night, but Maggie couldn't be happier with the beautiful little golden-haired boy she held in her arms. An hour later, as the sun peeked over the horizon, she and Walter celebrated their 10-year wedding anniversary as he stood at her bedside, watching Maggie nurse her newborn son, pulling him close to her heart with a tired smile. These were the days when mothers and their babies stayed in the hospital a week or more to recover and allow for observation. Maggie went home with her baby boy the morning of December 5th. Walking from the car to the front door, she pulled him close to shield him from the wind and freezing temperature. Leland met her at the door with Maggie's parents right behind him. They stayed another week to make sure their daughter and new grandson got settled in safely. Walter was grateful. Peter, his father-in-law, was a big help on the farm. At 61 years old, he had the strength and stamina of a much younger man. Anna, 11 years younger than Pete, was happy to do the cooking and cleaning. It felt good to be needed, especially now. At first, Maggie seemed healthy when she returned to the farm, but a few days later, after her parents left, the persistent cough that had lingered before the baby was born came back with a vengeance, along with a low-grade fever that wouldn't leave. By the new year, it was clear something was very wrong. On January 8, 1951, Maggie was diagnosed with tuberculosis. The doctor said her best chance at recovery was a new kind of lung surgery called a lobectomy to remove the infected part of her lung. It was experimental, but it offered hope. Walter did not hesitate. He needed her well. For the boys, for the farm, for him. Maggie agreed. On February 5, 1951, Walter's 37th birthday, Maggie spent 12 hours on the operating table. The procedure worked. The surgeon removed the diseased part of her lung and the TB was gone. But success came at a very high cost. Something went terribly wrong while Maggie was under anesthesia. She was deprived of sufficient oxygen, and when she woke up, the world she had known was gone, and the vibrant 31-year-old woman who had walked into the hospital just days before, she was gone with it. The doctors tried to soften the blow, saying she might regain some abilities over time, but Walter could see the truth written in their eyes. The Maggie he had married, the woman he had built a life with, the mother of 2 little boys waiting at home with their grandparents, that Maggie was gone. Her mental capacity was that of a 3-year-old child at best. She couldn't talk or walk. She had no memory of Walter, no recognition of her sons, no connection to the life they had built together. Even her parents were strangers. It might have been better if she had died. Instead, the world just turned inside out in the blink of an eye. On Monday, May 14th, the day after Mother's Day and just a few weeks after Jean's visit, Mama drove to Greenfield to see Walter and Maggie's farm. She went alone, leaving the girls with her mama and Martin in Grinnell. When Walter met her at the door, his face told a story that required no words. Though he was only 37, the deep lines etched into his forehead and around his eyes and mouth were those of a man far older. Walter greeted her politely, his voice steady but tired, and showed her through the main floor of the farmhouse. As he explained the circumstances that had led him to place an ad for a housekeeper, Mama listened carefully, not pressing him for details. She could see the care that had once been poured into this home. Family photos on papered walls above the well-worn wood floors. She didn't need Walter to say more. She already knew more than he likely wanted her to know. The weight of Maggie's illness, the strain of two small boys, and the long days working on the farm, Mama had heard enough from others to piece it all together. But she kept her thoughts to herself, letting Walter's story unfold in his own good time. Walter led Mama upstairs that were covered by a hand-loomed wool runner, its deep brown and ochre pattern worn soft by generations of footsteps. Woven by Danish hands long before Maggie was born, Mama could almost hear the echoes of those who worked the loom, passing the shuttle back and forth, weaving strength into every thread. This heirloom, more than 100 years old, was sturdy, unyielding, and meant to last, like the family who lived here. At the top of the stairs, she heard a baby crying. It couldn't be much further. Walter turned and led her down the hall to Maggie's room. Pictures of ancestors, maybe the rug weavers, were scattered among current family photos and several beautiful quilt samplers. She would have been mesmerized by what covered the floor and hung on the walls if not for those cries. And then they came to the bedroom. Here, Mama went speechless. Maggie sat in a stiff, high-backed wooden chair by the window, staring out at nothing. The glass stretched nearly from floor to ceiling, flooding the room with pale afternoon light. A heavy leather belt wrapped around her waist, threaded through the slats of the chair and buckled in the back, was holding her in place. The sharp scent of urine hit Mama like a punch. Her eyes dropped to the thin yellow stream trickling out from under the bed, seeping into the cracks of the hardwood floor. It pooled around her shoes, giving away the hiding place of Leland, the 4-year-old. But it was the baby, the 6-month-old, standing in a handmade oak cradle, that took her breath away. Evelyn Lee's tiny face was red and swollen, his cries tapering off into a soft, ragged whisper. Then Walter stepped forward, and Evelyn Lee's whole face lit up, breaking into a smile as big as the moon. Mama glanced at Walter, caught off guard by the way his expression softened. Without a word, he leaned over the cradle and brushed a rough, work-worn hand across the baby boy's cheek. For a moment, the tension in his shoulders softened, and Mama saw the man Walter could be, the man he must have been before life knocked him so hard. Later, she'd have to hold on to this moment. There would be no more like it once Walter got that wall around his heart built and securely in place. She looked at the baby in silence, but on the inside she was screaming. She'd seen that smile before, many times, on another face. Even if Jean hadn't already told her, she would have known instantly the secrets this house held. Mama's chest felt tight, as if the air had been pulled from the room. She looked at Walter, then at the baby, her mind racing. She thought about the trouble this man carried, the heartbreak etched into every line on his face, and wondered if he knew, if he had even the faintest suspicion about the truth. And then there was Maggie, bound to her chair, her spirit dimmed to nothing but a flicker of what it must have been. How much did she know? How much of this life, this family, had slipped through her fingers before she even had the chance to hold it tight? Mama swallowed hard, feeling the burden of what Jean had told her settle like a stone in her stomach. She wasn't sure what broke her heart more, the secrets, the silence, or the pain hanging in the air. Mama wanted to scream, to say something, but she didn't dare shatter the fragile balance holding this family together. Instead, she just stood there, looking at the baby's sunlit smile and wondering how much more this house could bear before it all came crashing down. When Walter showed Mama his makeshift solution, a child seat and portable bassinet strapped to his tractor so the boys could stay with him while he worked the farm, her heart, already in pieces, would not let her walk away. The thought of these two little boys out in the fields even one more time was unthinkable. Upstairs, Maggie sat tied to her chair by the window, watching the fields she'd never step into again. The gravity of what she'd seen settled on Mama's chest. This family needed more than a housekeeper. They needed a savior. Mama got the job and threw herself into it, doing everything she could to help Maggie and her boys. But every day was hard, some harder than others. Maggie had no memory of life before she got sick, no context for who she was or where she was. The therapies she got were basic at best, more about keeping her calm than bringing her back. 1950s medicine didn't know very much about fixing a brain after it got hurt. Maggie was left living in a body that looked familiar but felt like a stranger's. She looked like Leland's mama and Walter's wife from a distance, but up close, it was clear what wasn't there anymore. The woman she'd been, the vibrant, fiery Maggie Walter had married, was gone, like a flame snuffed out in the dark. Robbed of speech and the ability to walk, Maggie's moods could turn on a dime. Frustration boiled over into sudden fits of rage that left everyone around her on edge. The boys, especially Leland, lived in fear of her most of the time. She'd been his safe harbor once, the mama who kissed his scraped knees and sang him to sleep. Now, all he could see was the shadow of who she'd been, and it terrified him. It would be impossible for Mama to make the 4-hour drive from Rock Island to Orient every day, so her only choice was to move in. Leaving Willie Mae, the home she'd built for herself and her girls, and the job she loved. It was cracking her wide open. The loss of her marriage a year earlier already had her reliving so many heartaches from her own childhood, but this felt different. Maybe it was the pileup of all those hurts, stacked like a lifetime of dirty laundry she'd never get clean, that made this move so heavy. Or maybe it was knowing that this was the end of the life she'd fought so hard to build. Her independence, her freedom, all of it left behind in Rock Island. A few days after Mama moved in, Leland started hiding in dark corners where he'd mess his pants. No one had to tell her why this was happening. Mama's tender heart and her natural wisdom told her that shitting his pants was just the tip of the iceberg that had wrecked this little boy's life. She tried to help him, even covered up for his accidents, and it worked for a while. By the end of summer, the change in leaves gave Mama hope that things might be getting better for Leland. But then, one cold Saturday morning after breakfast, Daddy caught a whiff of what was going on. It had been a rough start for Maggie, one of those days when she woke up ready to destroy whatever or whoever came near. That meant it had been bad for Leland, too. "What in the Sam Hill are you doing?" Walter bellowed, jumping up from his chair and storming across the room. Daddy towered over the little boy crouched behind the basement door, blocking what little light Leland still had in his life. The little boy just stared, unblinking and wide-eyed, trembling in fear. Then he peed his pants. Walter's face turned red with rage. He grabbed Leland by the ear and dragged him across the room to the front door. Outside, by the water pump, he forced ice-cold water over Leland's head, screaming that this would be what happened if he ever shits his pants again. Mama ran outside to pull Walter back from this madness. He and Leland both screaming in unison, finally finding common ground. This was something they could do together. "Stop it! You're going to kill him," Mama screamed, pushing Walter away from the boy. Walter stumbled back, surprised by the strength of this woman. His shoulders slumped as he took another step back, tears filling his eyes. For a moment, Mama saw something in him, confusion, maybe shame. But there was no time to figure that out. Mama scooped up Leland and ran back inside, her heart pounding. Slamming the door behind her, she bent down to comfort the little boy, but he pulled away and ran up the stairs to his mama's room. Mama followed as fast as she could, fearing a repeat of the violent chaos she'd gone through with Maggie in the early morning hours. But when she reached the door, what she saw took her breath away. Maggie was sitting up in bed, her vacant eyes staring out the window. Leland stood next to her, his head buried in her lap, his shoulders shaking through his sobs. For a moment, Maggie didn't move, just stared straight ahead as if nothing was happening. Mama froze, expecting Maggie to push him away like she had every other time he'd sought her comfort. And then something changed. Maggie's hand lifted slowly and settled on Leland's head. Stroking his hair, she whispered, "Shh, shh," the sound so soft it could break. Mama stood in the doorway holding her breath. For the first time since she'd arrived, she saw something stir in Maggie, a flicker of who she used to be. And if only for a brief moment, Leland had his mama back. As unreliable as life had become, there was one thing you could count on. Every time Walter came into Maggie's view, she went wild, screaming and grabbing whatever was close at hand to throw at him. She found her mark when she hit him square in the head with a heavy alarm clock. It took 4 stitches to close the bloody gash. His visits to see his wife ended that day. Maggie was a lost soul, exiled to live in a world where nothing made sense. Mama often found Leland sitting just inside the door of her bedroom, watching the woman who used to be his mother. Mama had Walter trade the straight-back hardwood chair she'd found Maggie in for the rocker in the downstairs parlor. She sewed a cushion for the seat and another for the back, using a thick, soft flannel printed with pink peonies and roses. It seemed like a good choice, pretty and sturdy, and a lot more comfortable. Since that cold autumn morning at the water pump, when Leland went to his mother's room, he never knew what to expect. Some days she was almost his mama again. Other days she was a stranger, often an angry one. He learned to never get too close. This lady wasn't who he wanted her to be. Not anymore. But he just couldn't stop watching the woman who looked so much like his mother.